Well, I'm very grateful that you're clapping first, because it saves any embarrassment afterwards. In homage to our current Prime Minister, I have some tea and some throat drops, as forgive me, I am losing my voice. I was asked to speak about this a number of weeks ago, and in that wonderful parliamentary way, democracy rather took over. And the recent weeks have been rather busier than I intended, and this week, when I had assigned time to actually get down and write, various events have happened that many of you will have followed to interrupt what I would have liked to craft. So forgive me if this is rather more a collection of thoughts than a fully considered lecture. But perhaps I should start it by saying why I'm here, why I'm standing here as a practicing Democrat, if you like, as somebody who has actually thrown himself at the mercy of the people's feet in the ballots that we do every few years, rather more frequently than I was promised when I first took up the baton. The reality is I'm inspired still by the words of the US Declaration of Independence, that the purpose of man, that the right of man is the pursuit of life, liberty, is the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And for me, that last of those is absolutely the most fundamental. I think it is the most noble aspiration of humanity. I think it is the most aligned to human dignity, the ability that humans have the right to pursue happiness. Because, of course, happiness is fundamentally free. Happiness cannot be channeled, cannot be defined as a collective, but must be identified as an individual. And that's why, although that statement sounds universal, the truth is it's not. The truth is it comes out of a particular. And in this case, the particular is, of course, Western civilization and the culture that we have grown up in and that we have inherited. So I'll talk, if I may, on 3 points. The first is that if we're going to talk about democracy, we must talk about what it is. And democracy is a conversation. It's not an event or a series of events. The second is that democracy grows out of human dignity, not the other way round. And human dignity grows out of rights. And the third of these is that rights are not theological, but evolutionary and economic, though theology does underwrite them further. And I'll lastly touch on a few things about what I think this means for us today in Britain. The first question that I wanted to address was why democracy is a conversation and not an event. The focus in recent weeks and months has, as Professor Lachlan mentioned, been on 2 and maybe more particular events. The German election, of course, with the growth of the AfD, Brexit, and the election of Donald Trump in the United States. And these sound like events. They sound like events because of the way we talk about them. They sound like events because of the way we look at foreign pressures, perhaps Russian involvement in Facebook, perhaps how we look at the migration crisis that triggered a reaction in not only our own country, or at least the perception of it triggered a reaction in our own country, I would argue that led to some aspects of Brexit, and in Germany that led to the rise of the AfD. But that, I'm afraid, is to simplify it. Because these events didn't happen on a day, they happened over weeks and months. And they happened not because of those events, but because of the supporting structures that went into them. And that's why I'd say that democracy relies on a few things. 3, in fact. I'd say it relies on leadership, on engagement, and on information. The reason I say leadership is because most people are busy. No matter how many people get involved in any political discussion, it has become clear to me that most people wish to have their voices heard, but not necessarily to be the ones who have to take over the process of organizing it. Now, I'm sure this would not be true in a university where the qualities of leadership amongst the academic staff are such that every conference is merely an enlightened, Platonic debating society. But in some parish councils, and occasionally in borough, district, county, and sometimes in Parliament itself, that Platonic ideal falls somewhat short. And what we instead find is we find that people want to be heard, but are not willing to lead. And that's why I'd argue that leadership demands listening, not just talking. Because if we are to lead, listening to those who we are said to represent is the fundamental of the first process of the conversation that is the democratic debate. The second is that it's engagement. We all rely on engagement because, of course, having spoken about leadership is to focus only on one element. And this is where, forgive me, as an elected politician, I'm always quite cautious to remind people that this is a bargain. And I can only do my job if you do yours. Because I cannot represent those who will not tell me what they wish to be represented. And I cannot help those who will not speak out. So engagement is an absolutely fundamental part of the process, in both senses. I must do the listening, but others must do the talking too. The third of these is information. Because information, the knowledge of what is actually going on, the reality of the world around us, and the environment that we share, is absolutely fundamental to having either of the first two valid. And that is where the challenge that we've seen over the last few years has been arising. Because as we have hidden the truth, or seen the truth so obfuscated by myth, story, deception, or just downright fraud, we have found ourselves finding it much harder to have the engagement and much harder to find the leadership that is so necessary to have the democratic conversation. And instead what we've been finding is we've been finding ourselves having different conversations with different groups, having separate engagement with separate groups and different leadership in different groups. And all of those have done one thing. They have split the whole and they have carved the conversation. And in doing so, they have made the democratic answers that we seek, which are fundamentally only a way of finding an arbitrage between positions. We have made them much harder to find. But there is a fourth point that democracy requires. And this is something I feel very strongly that has been ignored by many elected groups in the past, but has certainly become stronger, certainly in my mind recently. And that is the concept that democracy provides an answer, or rather, perhaps better, democracy provides the answer. It is a myth to say that we can know the will of the people any more than we can know the mind of God. The answer that we get in one poll on one question is a reflection of a complexity, a reflection of a multiplicity of views and thoughts and ideas, hopes, histories and dreams. And if we cannot get past the fact that this is actually a pattern that we're seeing, a woven, intricate pattern, and we think that instead what we're getting is a binary decision, we then cease to be able to follow it up with the continuous engagement of the conversation that must follow. And we start to treat democracy again as an event and not a process. It is in fact why I, though there are many other forms, as the Professor mentioned, am a firm advocate of the Westminster model, because it recognises, although a government may win an election, the voice of the opposition is still lawful, clear, valid, and responsible. It is still right that members for different communities, that representatives for different groups speak out, even though 50 plus 1 voted in favour of one side or another. The fact that a democratic decision has been taken does not, as the old line goes, mean it's one man, one vote, one time, but that you have a continuum possible. That's where I start on democracy. But it's worth thinking about, where does our democratic moment emerge from. Because this is, although we claim it as some way a long history from the Greeks to today, I think there are quite a few Greeks who would not have seen the city-states as democratic. Women, for a start, slaves, anyone from anywhere else, people who had in any way a disability of any kind, or who had just fallen out in some way. I think I'm right in saying that the democratic mandate of a city-state in Greece was approaching 10%, which in our own system would somehow lack a little legitimacy. So where does our concept of democracy come from? Well, it does come from human dignity. And it comes from the Western civilization tradition that I was speaking about. Because that tradition comes straight out of the Judeo-Christian tradition that we've all inherited. And whether or not you are an atheist Democrat, or whether you are a Muslim Democrat, if you are a British Democrat, you are fundamentally a Judeo-Christian Democrat, because the type of democracy you have inherited is reliant on that cultural tradition. That's not making a statement of theology, and that's not making a statement of whose God is greater or whether indeed God exists. It's merely recognizing that culture is informed by religion and religion by culture. And for us, as Judeo-Christian Democrats, that comes from the concept that we inherited from the Old Testament of equality before God. And once you start from that process, once you start from the idea that the individual is a unit who can have equality before God, you start with the idea of individual action, and we get into doctrines like free will, and we get into doctrines like salvation of the individual in various manners, whether through grace or through acts or through deed. But whichever way we see salvation, whichever way we see individuality before God, we're recognizing not a collective, but a unit. And that sets us apart from many other traditions. It is hard in Islamic democracy, for example, to see the individual as opposed to the group, for a whole series of cultural reasons. The same is true in Chinese democracy. And yes, I do argue that there is such a thing as Chinese democracy. It is not the same as the one we would recognize that's true. And having spent many years in Afghanistan trying to bring stability, I would argue again that there is such a thing as Afghan democracy. I'd argue there was no such thing as an Afghan nation state, but there was certainly something called Afghan democracy. It was just at a sub-state level. And those groups which were able to practice democracy could only do it on a collective basis. They couldn't do it on an individual basis. And one could argue many reasons why that may have been so, but I would argue that the roots are cultural and to do with the structure of their societies as they had grown up. Whereas in our own state, we have grown up recognizing the rights of the individual. That has pushed us to the individual rights, and through that, to human dignity. Now, of course, this grew up in our own tradition in the Middle East and grew up through the various university traditions that we see in Palermo, and then coming up through places like Bologna into Paris, and eventually into fine universities like Cambridge and dumps like Oxford. And sorry, and we see this tradition as it's moving through, inspiring people as it goes, because we see the changes that it brings as it moves through. Various moments stick in my mind as particularly seminal. And though, of course, it is, because we're British, it's the one that we all refer to, Magna Carta, the Great Charter of 1215. We think of it as a fundamentally British document. We forget it was written by French knights to control the French lord who had invaded an Anglo-Saxon state. We've got to remember that that came out of the same tradition. It came out of exactly the same tradition of universities, particularly of the University of Paris, where so many of these theories had grown up. We then see it evolve, of course, in reference to both our own developments of liberties and, of course, the development of liberties through the Reformation period, into the Bill of Rights, eventually to the US Declaration of Independence, as we spoke about, to the Déclaration de la Droit de l'Homme that came about, of course, following the French Revolution, and then in almost our own time, to the European Convention of Human Rights and the United Nations Declarations of Human Rights. And this evolution, and I would argue it was an evolution, saw the stretch of rights going not just from the individual with power, as of course that Magna Carta document did. I mean, we talk about it as the foundation of human rights, as it were, in the UK, or rather in England more specifically. And of course, technically that's true, so long as you were landed, were a baron, had various forms of political power, weren't a serf, weren't a woman, and again, the various constraints that would have otherwise applied. When you get to the Declaration of Independence in the United States, until, of course, the Civil War, the rights of man did not include African slaves. And even the droits de l'homme, the Déclaration des droits de l'homme, includes the most wonderful expression of equality, where it says that decisions over the education of a child must be shared equally between a husband and his wife, unless they disagree, in which case the husband decides, demonstrating that equality is only up to a point, even when speaking about universal rights. By the time we get to the ECHR and the United Nations, of course, we're moving on to a different concept of rights. In the ECHR, what we're really doing is we're imposing British rights overseas. And it's something that I'm afraid many of my colleagues, I would argue, have misunderstood, is that the ECHR is not the imposition of European rights on Britain, but the imposition of British rights on Europe, written by mostly, in fact, Conservative members of Parliament in the immediate post-war years, when they were seeking to avoid the crimes that had been committed by the various fascist states in Europe being ever repeated. By the time we get to the UN, of course, we get into very different concepts of rights, and this is where human dignity starts to develop into a very different area, and becomes in some ways problematic, because I would argue that there is a moment where human dignity becomes political and no longer a concept of rights. When it becomes the right to impose restrictions on others to a degree through various forms of taxation, at what point do they become political? Now, there is clearly a debate to be had here, but that's where I would argue that we are beginning to stretch human dignity and human rights into a new concept, which is effectively social rights. But I spoke about the third thing, which was that rights are not theological but evolutionary and economic. I hope I've touched on why I think they're evolutionary, but let me touch on why I think they're economic. Despite the theology that I've spoken about, despite the Judeo-Christian links that have drawn us, I would argue, from the temple through to the parliament, we find ourselves today looking at rights that grew very much the economic power of the individual. There are some very seminal moments in our own history which demonstrate this. And funnily enough, one of them is the Black Death. With the spread of disease across Europe in the 1300s, the working population, the peasantry, was wiped out to a greater extent. Well, everybody was wiped out. But the people relied, the rulers relied very much on the labor of the bottom. And of course, as they died, about a third of them died, the pressure on labor became greater, the wages increased. And you start to see the growth of rights in the late 1300s, leading to, of course, the Uprising in Kent, a very fine county, as you all know. And a man of Kent, Wat Tyler, marched out of Canterbury with various others, objecting to a poll tax. I had no connection to Mrs. Thatcher, of course, but merely a tax, another form of taxation. But by then his economic might had grown, and it had grown because of the death of his equals, if you like, and it had grown because his economic rights had grown. Now, he did make an unfortunate decision, which was to go into private conference with Richard II at Smithfield. It turned out that the king's view of private conference was not quite the same as his. The king had a rather stricter definition of secrecy and killed him. But the idea the example that demonstrates that economic power leads slowly to civic power is actually an example that is then copied again and again throughout not only English history, but British history and also European history. We see the growth, for example, of women's rights in this country, brought very strongly about by the First World War, not deliberately, of course, but the absence of men led to the economic empowerment of women, and the economic empowerment of women led to the civic empowerment of women. That is, I would argue, one of the things that we must learn when we talk about rights, because as we talk about rights so often, we often see it as a theological doctrine that, and we are not all of the order of preachers, seeking to go out and convert the masses. What we should be thinking about perhaps more is how to empower and lead upwards. And that's why I would come on to the last of my points, what this means for us. The first, I'm going back to a point I made earlier, that I repeat because I think it matters so much, is that engagement matters. And that responsibility goes both ways. It is not just my job to listen, it is others' job to talk. It is not just ministers' job to talk, it is their job to listen to me too. That process of interaction, that process of dialogue, is the fundamental democratic conversation that must endure. But in order for it to work, it requires understanding, and understanding requires knowledge, it requires trust and truth, and it requires complexity. And that's one of the areas that I think we are truly challenged on today. Because complexity requires time. Indeed, this lecture is an example of it. But it requires time that we afford ourselves very poorly, whether it is because of the pressures of family or work or whatever. We are very poor at devoting the time we require to understanding the complexities that affect us. And so we look for the simplicity. We look to buy the indulgence rather than to pray it. And in doing so, we fail to achieve either and lead instead to confusion. The second point I would argue it means for us is that man is made for the law. Or is he? I would argue not. But as we've seen the growth of rights culture come up, what we've seen time again is we've seen laws being created and justified for the fact that they're there. We're seeing it today in Catalonia. We've seen it in other parts as well. The reason I mention Catalonia is not because I think that the Spanish are wrong or right. I'm not expressing a view on that. I'm merely expressing a view that when laws cause major civic unrest, it appears to me that there must be better ways to structure the laws, to structure the conversation, than to have frameworks that lead to clash rather than to discussion. And so I would argue, no, the law is made for man, not man for the law. But that also means that process matters. Because if we get the process wrong, we do lead ourselves down to positions where it is hard to adapt. And that is the challenge of this Brexit vote, of course. Not that I would argue that it was either right or wrong. Those of you who know my position will know it, and those of you who don't, it doesn't matter. But what does matter is that it wasn't a binary answer, and it has somehow been set as an ultimate against which no challenge can be made. But it doesn't actually answer any question. So how do we structure, or rather how do we unstructure that process so that we restructure it into the way that we can have a conversation? Because the point of the Westminster system, and the reason I value it, is because it enables that conversation to continue. And not just to end, but actually to continue for generations to come. In fact, it was Churchill's great line, as you'll remember, we build our buildings and then our buildings, no, we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. Well, the same is true, of course, of our laws. And the third point I wanted to make is that rights start at the lowest level. If we get it right, we empower from the bottom. And this isn't just true in our Judeo-Christian sense, as I've been stressing throughout this, but it is actually true in other senses too. One of the interesting changes that I've seen in the last decade is the growth in rights culture in China. Now, I'm not going to argue that international human rights are applied universally throughout the Chinese dominions. But one of the changes that is very interesting is that intellectual property is now being valued. Where 20 years ago, China was very much a center for, how can I put it, artisanally made luxury goods. It now defends very aggressively intellectual property, in fact, in some ways more aggressively than some Western states. And it does so because it has realized that the individuals coming up with ideas, developing concepts, and being able to express them and monetize them are profiting the whole, and that therefore their rights matter. Their rights matter for everyone. And that has spread also into land rights, not just a little bit in China, but actually in other parts of the world. One of the most empowering things, that the projects that I've seen, is a land rights project in Ghana, where a series of trainee lawyers, British trainee lawyers, went out and effectively did land cases for about 6 months. They ended long-running feuds, they ended disputes, and they saw economic empowerment grow because, of course, people finally had something they knew was theirs, and they could therefore confidently develop, confidently sell, and invest the money somewhere else, invest the effort somewhere else. So we can grow rights from the bottom. But we can also do more than that. We in the UK, and indeed much of the West, are facing a huge challenge, which we know is fundamentally demographic, which is, we can call it whatever, an age bubble, whatever, however we wish to address it. But there is a fundamental truth that much of our assets are now beginning to accumulate in things like property, which are no longer effectively generating income, they're just storing it. And we need to find a better way of securing growth for ourselves. And I would argue very strongly that for us, a growth in rights culture is a way of addressing that. Because if we can use our money, if we can use our energy and our time to grow rights at an incremental level, at a low level, at a land and intellectual property level, we can start to grow economies with which we can trade and engage with young people who we didn't have here for various reasons in the 1960s and 70s, which has led to the bubble that cannot be filled in the short term. So those are my thoughts on democracy and human dignity. I'm afraid they are ill-prepared, and I'm afraid they are feeble, but that is all I can offer. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for being so honest, and indeed for also, I think, giving to the floor a number of hot topics and questions that can be addressed, some perhaps too hot for you. But I think I was minded, actually, as you were speaking, and just hear the end of this sentence before you react, that in many respects you have a lot in common with Toynbee, not Polly, right? But I believe one of Polly's ancestors, Arnold, because what you talk about in relation to something that in some quarters might be unfashionable around Western civilization, around its origins, around what you talked about, the complexity and the understanding that is required when one looks in at democracy of something that is evolving, not just rights, but the democratic journey that is evolving. I'm minded of that debate from the interwar period between Toynbee and Spengler about whether or not democracy, or indeed the West, continues or survives. And as you know, Spengler was quite pessimistic. It wouldn't survive, it would follow in the trajectory of all other human civilizations of, I think, 23 or 24. They would rise, it had its dominance, it would fall. And Toynbee said no, that it wouldn't, that it would survive because of the role of creative minorities. Now, that has been reintroduced in our lifetime by Joseph Ratzinger, who uses it in relation to the Catholic Church, but it's taken, in his footnote, it's taken directly from Toynbee. And you touched on democracy being a process, not just an event, about the interdependent dynamic between leadership, engagement, and information, about democracy and its philosophical and cultural origins and its link back to the notion of the individual in the Judeo-Christian story. There are two things I would perhaps respond to your talk with. One would be perhaps to ask you about what is often perceived as being quite a core crisis within Western democracy, and if we were to limit it to the United Kingdom, a crisis within UK democracy around the cohesion of the state. What is happening, for example, with Brexit? Often there is a focus simply on the symptom, but not the causes that go into it. And when you expanded on the process point, that it simply wasn't an event, too often people focus on just the specific vote or the specific result. And I'm struck by, not only in our society, but indeed in other societies, that have we lost something of the roots of who we are and how we participate in the polity? Have we lost something in the area of political and economic cohesion? So people have been left behind. You talked about engagement and the need for people to engage with you. But yet, until Brexit, we saw a whole group in society that didn't engage, either because a system wasn't listening or they lacked the skills or the tools to engage. So how would we overcome that cohesion? How do we learn from the surprises that are Brexit or the surprises that are Trump? And then the final comment, which links into this, is that we have a crisis, that crisis of confidence that we have internally risks playing out externally. So you see other parts of the world which traditionally have looked to Europe and to the West as a model to follow of human rights, of what you call the evolving rights, of a representative democracy, of a liberal democracy, of a rather liberal economic order. And since 1989, it's as if we have lost some of the balance in our society. And other models in different parts of the world, other models of governance, out of Asia, for example, the model from Singapore, or the model which China seems to be following, which promises material benefits, but it's not balanced with the same cultural and philosophical benefits that are coming out of the Western tradition. But until we get our own cohesion right, socially, economically, and politically, and until our democratic culture is held more profoundly, not only by elites, but by the populace at large, do we not face an impediment abroad in having the confidence to go out and to basically not impose a democratic political order, but to confidently say, this is the fruit of a civilization which has been evolving for some thousands of years, and it is one that we believe leads to fundamental human flourishing based upon human dignity. And whilst there are different variations of governance across the world, and one has to be careful not to have a feeling of Western superiority or imperialism, it is genuinely to export something that has worked to empower our citizens in previous eras and generations. And maybe in recent years it has faltered, but is there not something now that perhaps we need to reinvigorate? And I come back again to where I started, that what you talk about here, and what comes out very clearly, is a concept of somebody that sees very much the value of our democratic tradition, of how it can be renewed, of where some of its flaws are, and where some of the home truths need to be spoken, even above and beyond perhaps what we rarely hear in contemporary politics, which often tends to play to the gallery. So I do think you are inheriting something of the Toynbee legacy, not just Polly. Thank you.
Would you like me to respond or wait?
Yeah, respond immediately.
Okay. I'll respond to various of those points. You're right to raise state cohesion, and my emphasis on economic empowerment as a route to civic empowerment is just as true in our own society as it is anywhere else. It's just as true in our own time as it was at any other. And I would argue, and this is not going to surprise you, I am a conservative. I do fundamentally believe in the rights of the individual. I'm not a socialist, and I'm certainly not a Corbynite. But it is true that the whole only works if the whole works. And that's where some of our economic policies have got to really be reviewed and challenged. Because it is not possible to have a cohesive state if some are not able to play an economic part in it. After all, it's hard to be a capitalist if you have no capital. And that crisis of confidence that we have seen is one of the reasons, I would argue, that we saw the Brexit result and the Trump result. And again, I'm not commenting on the right or wrong of either of them. I think there are arguments to be made. But I do think that a rage of disempowerment fed into many other things at the same time. You did speak about other models as well, China and Singapore. And of course, you're right that they are, in some ways, pushing various of those models more than they have been in the past. And for example, the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, a Chinese model, almost a Chinese IMF, if you wish, is in some ways exporting or seeking to export that Chinese economic doctrine of government power. I would argue it's more complex than that. I would argue that the AIIB and the reason why the United Kingdom was right to join it is both that export, but also it's tying into our own concepts of rule of law, because it demands not only of the recipient, but also the donor, and in this case, rather largely the Chinese state, that it applies certain rules to the conditions of its investment. Now, that's more than in many ways the Chinese have done in the past with their investments. So I would argue that this is part of the growth of rights that we've seen in intellectual property and a little bit in land rights in China, and it's part of that continuity. But of course you're right, there are challenges. And of course you're right that we must be prepared to defend them, not just because they have empowered us, but actually where they have worked, they have empowered millions. When we look at China today, and forgive me for focusing on China, but it's so rich with examples, it's hard to avoid. The great growth of wealth, the loss of the very poorest across much of our world has come about in China. The amazing success of the Chinese economic miracle of the last 20 years has seen literally millions lifted out of poverty. And it's happened, I would argue, again with that growth of rights, that growth of understanding of law. Because in a very fundamental sense, all of life is in a funny way a trust exercise. The truth is, nation states don't exist, they're just what we agree them to be. Parliaments don't exist, they're just what we agree them to be. Your university, I'm afraid, Francis, doesn't exist, it's just what we agree it to be. And the same is true of the future. There is no possible confidence in the future unless we agree it. And all we're doing by writing laws is we're discussing in advance what we will agree the future to look like. And therefore, it is an exercise in building trust. And it is that exercise, that building trust, that builds the trust between us, encourages us to share our efforts, encourages us to invest our finances, and encourages us to plan for the future. And that is the only way, so far, that human beings have found to achieve prosperity and achieve liberty and achieve the pursuit of happiness.